Why, hello everyone. My name is Mike, and this is the bored Cyborg. Welcome back to yet another horror film review. I've been on a horror kick, as you guys could probably tell, as of late. And I noticed on my channel, I have only talked about one black and white film. And it doesn't even really count as a black and white film. Well, it does. But that film is Night of the Living Dead. Obviously, that came out in '68, so it didn't have to be made in black and white like the film I'm talking about today. Going further than that, I've yet to talk about a film from one of my favorite decades in horror, the 1930s. The Universal monster films, I started watching when I was in my early 20s. I did not grow up with them, sadly. I always thought black and white, when I was a kid, I thought black and white movies were for sissies. I thought black and white was so uncool. And turns out, I was uncool. The Universal monster movies have turned into some of my favorite films of all time. The Wolfman being probably my favorite. It's always changing. Son of Frankenstein. Frankenstein meets Wolfman. I've seen almost all of them at this point, and I adore all of them for different reasons, even the not-so-good ones. There's something about the atmosphere when it comes to Universal's films in the 1930s. I can't quite articulate it. Whenever I watch them, I feel at home. Just like 80s anime, and 90s action movies, and 90s horror, and 80s horror. I feel at home. And it's this warm, comforting feeling, no matter if it's bright outside, or dark, or storming, or snowing, I feel like I'm at home when I'm watching these movies. It's the best way to describe it. And the Universal films capture an atmosphere that not many filmmakers today even care to capture anymore, which breaks my heart. So the film I'm talking about today is Bela Lugosi's The Raven. Now, The Raven is in this set. This is the Bela Lugosi collection. It really should be called the Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff collection. Not only does Karloff co-star in this with Lugosi, but 4 out of 5 of the films on the back here, they're in together as well. Those films are The Black Cat, The Raven, The Invisible Ray, and Black Friday. It hurts me to say, but Scream Factory recently put out a collection with those 4 films, and I want it so badly. I can't afford it right now. Hopefully it doesn't go out of print like the Vincent Price one did, the first Vincent Price one. But they are on Blu-ray now, and I can't wait to see the transfers, because Universal does an unbelievable job with these transfers, guys. These films look so crisp and so clean. The restoration process must be so arduous for these movies, but they do it because they know the fans want it, and they know they care. And do I care about these films looking as pristine as they deserve to look. Sorry for that divergence, but I really had to talk to you guys about my love for the 30s, and the 40s for that matter, before I got into reviewing The Raven, which is the film I'm talking about today. The Raven stars Lugosi as the lead. Karloff is a supporting character, but basically his co-star. The story follows a master surgeon named Dr. Vollin, who is played by Bela Lugosi. Dr. Vollin is the best in his class. And he's also a little off-kilter. Well, very off-kilter. But in the beginning we learn that he is obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe. Specifically the story The Pit and the Pendulum. Which, this film is sort of an amalgam of the Raven poem and The Pit and the Pendulum. Or I should say it's inspired by. It doesn't really have much to do with either story. I have read both stories. It's very much so inspired by rather than based on. And so Dr. Vollin is obsessed with Poe and these particular stories, so much so that he has a raven in his office which casts a beautiful shadow. 30s films are all, black and white films are all about shadows and where they're placed and what they mean and the emotions that they evoke. He has a raven, a taxidermied raven it looks like, on his desk, but he goes even further than that by building and creating replicas of some of the torture devices that Poe explains and describes in his stories, namely The Pit and the Pendulum.
Suddenly he hears some peculiar noise coming from above his head. He looks up and sees a knife flashing.
A young girl named Jean Thatcher gets into an accident in the beginning of the film. She's engaged to a wealthy man and her father is wealthy. She gets into a car accident that is nearly fatal. In fact, it is going to prove to be fatal if they don't get her fixed. And all of the surgeons are either not available or they aren't as good as Dr. Vollin is. So they're forced to call Dr. Vollin, who has sort of a stigma around his name, but he's a brilliant surgeon, and pretty much at this point the only one that could save her. He does so, and in the process, the two of them grow eerily close in a very strange relationship that isn't quite sexual. It's attraction in sort of a weird father-daughter kind of thing going on. It's hard to explain, but essentially Vollin is obsessed with her. And he's manipulated her in sort of a sociopathic sort of way to start obsessing over him. That fades over time, but his obsession, Vollin's obsession, does not. What happens is Jean Thatcher's father sees what's going on with Dr. Vollin and his daughter is to be married by a young man, an affluent young man who is perfectly respectable. And so he approaches Dr. Vollin and says to him, "I don't want you seeing my daughter anymore," in a very 1930s professional, very old English sort of manner, and says, "I don't want you seeing my daughter anymore." Dr. Vollin doesn't take this very well, and he freaks out. He flips out at the judge. It's actually the judge of the town, Judge Thatcher. He flips out, and this is the first time we see past the obsession, the weird kind of arrogant. He's also very arrogant. You know, he knows he's the best and he flaunts it. But we see past that. We see madness in his eyes. And Lugosi does such a wonderful job in this. I think he was a great actor. Unfortunately, a lot of his... There are more bad Lugosi films than good ones, I would say. But the ones that he chose that are great films with great directors, he absolutely kills it, in my opinion. His expressiveness is way before its time for the 30s. He runs the gamut in this, from just that maddened look to a very condescending look to pure joy. He runs the gamut in this, and he does such a fantastic job. So essentially what happens is Dr. Vollin plots to take his vengeance for not being able to have Jean Thatcher. And he does so in a very Dr. Phibes sort of way. I know Dr. Phibes, the director, Robert Fuest, and the writers, I'm sure they saw this film and were fans of it. Maybe even grew up with it. And so there's a lot of Dr. Vollin and Dr. Phibes. And going further than that, I think Dr. Phibes was sort of the prototype for Saw. James Wan probably grew up watching the Abominable Dr. Phibes. See, it's a vicious cycle. It's a beautiful cycle. And so there's even Saw elements in this film because it has to do with torture. Now, I have to say, for the time, this film must have been so controversial. And I've read that not many people went to go see it because of the concepts that were on display here. I mean, we have torture. We have madness. We have disfigurement. We have all of these concepts that people weren't doing in the 30s. It was taboo, to say the least. But in The Raven, we get them. So this is about the point where Boris Karloff's character, I would say towards the end of the first act, is where Boris Karloff's character comes into play. And I have to say, he is billed as Karloff. This happened a lot in the 30s with Universal films, but they didn't even need his first name. Karloff, motherfuckers, you know who it is. Come on and see the movie. We don't even need to put his first name. Capital letters, Karloff. I love it. It happened with Lugosi as well at some points in his career, although I don't think in this film. Karloff's character's name is Edward Bateman. He busts into Dr. Vollin's office, and it's clear that he's escaped. And we learn later he escaped from prison, and he's eluding getting caught by the police. And at gunpoint, he forces Dr. Vollin to operate on his face, to change his appearance so that he could live in peace, because he's wanted by the cops, and I think he's going to be put to death. So that's what Edward Bateman busts in Dr. Vollin's office and forces him to do. And so, of course, Vollin is like, Sure, I will help change your face. No problem. You know, he's very patronizing, but Bateman doesn't know what he has planned for him. And so what happens is Vollin operates on his face to change it, and in the process disfigures him. His eyes all droopy. He looks like the Toxic Avenger in some ways. It reminded me of that. And he completely disfigures him. He changes his face all right. Edward Bateman is pissed. Karloff's character is pissed. But there's nothing he can do to Vollin, because Vollin is the only one that could change his face and fix it and bring it back to what it normally was, or at least something different so that he could evade the police as was originally intended. So he's got him by the balls, essentially. Vollin's got Bateman by the balls. Therefore, he bids Bateman do his bidding. And he becomes sort of an Igor type of character, a servant. And it's just a brilliant character. Now, Bateman starts out as this criminal who's on the lam, and he's a bad human being, and he has a great arc. By the end of it, he's made sort of a 180. He has a new outlook on life, and it really is a wonderful little character arc that's expressed in about 45 minutes, which is impressive. And there's a great line when Edward Bateman is basically forcing Dr. Vollin to fix him, to change his face.
Your monstrous ugliness breeds monstrous hate. Good. I can use your hate.
And that line just gave me chills, honestly. I think it perfectly sums up what The Raven is all about, because the irony of that line is that Vollin is talking about himself. Yes, he's talking about Bateman, this ugly criminal who he blames his ugliness and his being an outcast in society for his criminal ways. And Vollin, when he says this, there's a madness in his eye. And it's that irony that really comes full circle with me, because he's not only talking about Bateman, but he's more so talking about himself, because he's the true ugly one. Bateman's just a victim of circumstance. So the story basically rounds out with Vollin inviting everybody to his home, including the judge and his daughter and her fiancé, and trapping them in his house, which is a death trap. I mean, he's got rooms, the bedrooms, go up and down on sort of elevators, down to his torture dungeon. And he's got a pendulum that swings back and forth slowly, inch by inch, coming closer to the person's gut to slice them open. We never really see anything like that, but the implication is there, and that's really all that's needed in especially films from the 30s. But he traps them in his death trap, with a bunch of eccentric, rich characters. And they're all interesting in their own rights, but they're there for Vollin to sort of have his way with. And man, it culminates in just a wonderful finale, a tense finale, where Vollin just goes way off the deep end. Obviously, his vengeance, the revenge he's taking, has completely blinded him. And you really feel sympathy for not only all of the characters that he's captured and is about to torture, but you feel sympathy more so than any of them for Vollin. And Dr. Vollin is a sympathetic character, and Bela Lugosi knocks it out of the park. Nobody could have done it as good as he did, except for maybe Karloff, to be quite honest. The roles reversed, I could see it working, but I'm so glad it ended up the way it did. And that's the interesting thing, too. They were in a bunch of films together, 6 or 7 films, Body Snatcher, the 4 that I named, Black Cat, The Raven, Invisible Ray, Black Friday, and a couple more, I believe. And usually Lugosi is the imposer. You know, he's the lead, he's the first build. He always gets the better of Bela Lugosi's characters. But not in this movie. And it's so good to see Bela Lugosi sort of take the upper edge, or get the edge on Boris Karloff's character. He truly is the imposer in this situation, the dominator in this situation. And it's cool to see a role reversal, because usually it was the other way around. Because Karloff, his stature, you know, his gaunt look, that's just sort of how the story's played out in his favor. But in this, Bela Lugosi shines, and it's one of his best performances. And another person that I have to mention who was involved with this film, as well as dozens of other Universal monster movies, that is Jack Pierce. And if you don't know Jack Pierce, you know Jack Pierce, because if you've seen Boris Karloff's Frankenstein monster, or you've seen Dracula, or you've seen The Wolfman, and I'm not talking about the movies, just the image, the likeness of these immortal characters, then you know Jack Pierce because he did the makeup. He was the progenitor of cinematic monster movie makeup. Without him, there's no Stan Winston or Rick Baker. Jack Pierce was a brilliant makeup artist, and he did the work in this. And I wouldn't say it's some of his best work. In fact, there's not much for him to do in this. He just basically does the disfigurement. Obviously, he did probably all the makeup, all of the more normal, regular makeup, but he obviously designed the disfigurement. And like I said, it's effective, especially for the time. It reminds me of a lot of other movies that came later, and I'm sure the Toxic Avenger with the droopy eye got inspiration from this movie in particular, as well as many others. But Jack Pierce, I had to mention him because he is a master of makeup, and he deserves to be talked about and immortalized. Of course, the lighting and the cinematography for the time are fantastic. I love how much they perfected the black and white film in the 30s and 40s. Really a lot in the 40s, but you could see so many glimpses of brilliance with the shadow play in this film, especially the Raven, like I said, sort of the shadow cast on the wall, which is foreboding in its own right and symbolic. And I love the cinematography. There's a lot of smooth as they could be shots, and the camera moves quite a bit, and the static shots are staged wonderfully. And this is not only one of Bela Lugosi's best, but this is one of the best Universal films. Well, I'll say of all time, but of the 30s definitely, and of the 40s for sure. Of the 30s and 40s, no doubt. One of the best, and one of my favorite, if not my favorite, collaboration between Karloff and Lugosi. I absolutely love The Raven. I don't know if you guys are into the 30s and the 40s as much as I am. And if you're not, this gives me a good opportunity to try to sell these films to you and sort of look at them in through a different lens, because you have to when you're watching films from the 30s. This is nearly 100 years ago, which just gives me goosebumps. And there's something so special about these images that were captured nearly 100 years ago with actors that are immortalized because of film. And it really moves me, guys. I love these movies so much, and I'm here to sort of share my love for them with you. And if you're not into them, if you only watch movies from the 80s and 90s and 70s and so on, I hope that some of these reviews of old 30s and 40s films in black and white will change your perspective on them. So that is The Raven from 1935, directed by Lou Landers and starring Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff and a whole bunch of other actors that we don't care as much about. The Raven is fantastic. Check it out, especially if you're into black and white Universal films. This one usually gets left off the back burner, I think because of how controversial it was at the time, but it deserves to be rediscovered by fans of the old 30s Universal monster movies. That's why I'm talking about it. The Raven.
What a torture. What a delicious torture, Bateman.
I just want to thank you for checking out my review of The Raven from 1935 with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. It's a film that I've wanted to talk about for some time, and I needed to talk about something from the 30s with you guys. Something in black and white from the 30s or 40s, because they're decades that I absolutely love, and I don't talk about enough on this channel, and really haven't. So, shame on me. I'm doing it now, trying to rectify that, and moving forward, I do want to talk about more black and white films to sort of shed light on some of my favorites, some of the lesser-known ones, not the big ones like Frankenstein and The Mummy and Dracula. Those are films I will talk about, but I want to talk about some of the lesser, I shouldn't say that because it's not lesser, some of the more obscure films from Universal's catalog and from the 30s. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and if you're new to the channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, as well as the little bell for notifications. Anyway, guys, I will see you next time. Bored Cyborg out. Ha 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 ha! Ho 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 ho! Hee 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 hee! Ha